They laughed when my dad said it. 200 guests, crystal glasses, a perfect wedding. To the daughter who finally found someone desperate enough to marry her, I didn't say a word, but 2 minutes later my husband pressed play, and everything my father stole, lied about, and hid for decades filled the screen. By the next morning, his business partner had walked away, my mother had packed her bags, and my phone had over 70 missed calls. I'm Emily Carter, and this is the wedding my father thought he controlled, until the truth showed up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The chandeliers at Rosewood Estate caught the last of the early evening light, scattering it across crystal glasses and polished silverware like something out of a magazine spread. A jazz trio played near the terrace doors, soft enough to feel elegant, loud enough to fill the pauses between conversations. 186 guests sat in their seats laughing, leaning in, clinking champagne flutes. It looked like a perfect wedding. I was sitting at the head table in an ivory lace gown that had taken 6 fittings to get right, my hand resting on the white tablecloth beside my new husband's. Michael's thumb brushed against my knuckle in a small grounding gesture. If anyone had asked me in that moment how I felt, I would have said grateful, relieved, maybe even happy. I would not have said braced. The music faded. Chairs shifted. I heard the familiar scrape of a microphone being adjusted. My father stood. Robert Carter had always known how to command a room. At 62, he still carried himself like the man who'd built Carter Auto Group from a single used car lot into a regional chain. Navy suit custom-tailored, silver cufflinks. That smile he used when he wanted people to believe he was generous, charming, harmless. He tapped the microphone twice. All right, he said, chuckling. If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment. The room quieted instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses were lifted and held. I felt my stomach tighten, a reflex I'd learned before I was old enough to name it. Raise your glass, my father said, lifting his own. His voice was warm, confident, practiced. To my daughter who finally found someone desperate enough to marry her. For a split second, I didn't understand what he'd said. Not really. My brain tried to soften it to round off the edges the way it always had. Then the laughter hit. It came in waves. His business partners laughed first, the men in tailored suits who had flown in from Sacramento and San Jose. His golf buddies followed, slapping their knees, shaking their heads like it was a harmless joke. Even relatives I barely recognized smiled politely the way people do when they don't want to seem uptight. The sound felt endless. My fingers tightened around the stem of my champagne flute. The glass was cold slick. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. My chest burned a familiar ache that started somewhere behind my ribs and spread outward. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I was wrong. I stared down at the table at the place setting with my name embossed in gold, at the plate of untouched food. For a brief, humiliating moment, I wondered if I should laugh too. That instinct ran deep. Laugh, keep the peace, don't make it worse. Then I felt Michael's hand go still. He hadn't laughed. I turned my head just enough to look at him. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead, not on my father, not on the guests, but somewhere far past all of it. He looked calm, but it was the kind of calm that comes right before a storm. He stood up. The movement was smooth, deliberate. Chairs creaked, as a few people turned to watch him, curiosity replacing laughter. My father paused mid-chuckle, clearly amused. Well, Robert said into the microphone. Grinning, looks like the groom wants to add something. Michael didn't look at him. He walked toward the side of the room, where the projector had been set up to play our engagement photos later that evening. I watched, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the people next to me could hear it. Actually, Michael said his voice even, I'd like to add something now. A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Someone coughed. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small USB drive. It looked insignificant between his fingers, just a piece of plastic and metal. He plugged it into the laptop connected to the projector. The lights dimmed automatically. The sudden change made the room feel smaller, tighter. I heard my father clear his throat. But not as desperate as you are right now, Michael said. He said it quietly, calmly. But the microphone caught every word. For a heartbeat, no one reacted. Confusion passed across faces like a shared question. My father's smile faltered just slightly, like a crack in glass you don't notice until it spreads. The screen behind Michael flickered to life. I didn't see what was on it yet. I was watching my father. His hand, the one holding the champagne flute, began to shake. Just enough to notice if you were looking for it. The liquid sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the tablecloth. Then the glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, unmistakable crack. The sound cut through the room louder than the laughter had been. Shards skidded across the floor. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered my father's name. No one laughed this time. I felt something inside me break open, something I'd been holding together for decades. And just like that, 30 years of silence broke louder than the sound of glass. The dining room in our Sacramento house always looked like it belonged in a catalog. The table was long and heavy polished, so thoroughly it reflected the overhead light. The chairs were pushed in at perfect angles. Even the air felt stiff, like it knew better than to relax. I burst through the front door, clutching a large white envelope, my heart pounding so hard it made my ears ring. I was 17, breathless, hopeful, in a way I hadn't been taught to hide yet. "Dad," I said, already smiling, already halfway to the dining room. I got in. Robert Carter sat at the head of the table with his evening newspaper spread wide in front of him. He didn't look up right away. He turned the page slowly, deliberately, like I'd interrupted him for something trivial. Got into what he asked. "UC Davis," I said, holding the letter out like proof. "I got accepted." He glanced at the paper in my hand, then finally lifted his eyes to my face. His expression didn't change. "UC Davis, huh?" he said. "Not Stanford." The word landed heavy. He continued folding the newspaper. "I guess we take what we can get." My smile froze. Across the table, my mother, Maggie Carter, set down her fork. She forced a brightness into her voice that I would come to recognize as her armor. "That's wonderful, honey," she said. She reached under the table and squeezed my knee, her fingers warm and quick like she didn't want him to notice. My brother Daniel leaned back in his chair, 20 years old, and already carrying himself like he owned the room. He smirked. "Well," he said, "guess I'm still the overachiever in the family." Robert chuckled at that. Just once. I laughed too, because that's what I did when the alternative felt worse. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket like it was something private, something I should have known better than to share. That night I learned applause was optional in our house. Approval, even more so. A few months later, I stood at the curb with 2 suitcases and a duffel bag, trying to look excited instead of terrified. Maggie wrapped her arms around me and held on longer than necessary. Her chin rested on my shoulder. "Call me when you get there," she whispered. "Call me when you get settled. Call me if you need anything. I will." I said, swallowing hard. From the doorway, Robert cleared his throat. "Don't forget to send thank you notes to the family," he said. "People helped make this happen." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure who he meant. UC Davis was beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. Tree-lined paths, open lawns, students laughing like they belonged there. I worked mornings at a coffee shop just off campus, afternoons in the library, nights hunched over my desk in the dorm. My textbooks were filled with highlighter marks, and notes scribbled in the margins. My hands always smelled faintly of espresso. I liked being busy. Busy meant I didn't have to think too much. Halfway through my first year, an email hit my inbox with the subject line, "Account balance due." I opened it, standing in line at work, my apron still on. Tuition balance, $50,000. I stared at the number until the words blurred. That couldn't be right. I refreshed the page. It didn't change. I remembered something my Aunt Helen had said years earlier, almost casually, while passing me a plate of cookies at Thanksgiving. "Your grandparents left $45,000 just for you, sweetie. They wanted to make sure you could go wherever you wanted." I stepped outside and called home. Robert answered on the second ring. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just got an email from the university. It says I still owe $50,000. There was a pause on the line. Papers shuffled. "So he said," so I repeated. "I thought there was an education fund from Grandma and Grandpa." Another pause, longer this time. "That money wasn't enough," he said flatly. "I had to use it for other family expenses." My grip tightened on my phone. "What expenses?" "You don't need to know that," he snapped. "Don't question me." I opened my mouth, then closed it again. "Okay," I said quietly. "That's what student loans are for." He added, his tone already bored. "Builds character." The call ended with a click. I stood there on the sidewalk, the campus buzzing around me, and felt something shift. It was subtle, like a hairline crack. That was the first time I realized his voice wasn't authority. It was fear dressed as pride. The loans followed me through college like a shadow. Every semester, every bill, every reminder that I was paying for something that had already been paid for once. I learned to budget down to the dollar. I learned which meals I could skip and which shifts I could pick up. I graduated in 2015. Robert didn't come. He said he had an important meeting. Later, scrolling through social media, I saw a photo of him at a golf tournament smiling beside a trophy, his arms slung around one of his partners. I closed the app without liking the post. That Thanksgiving, I came home wearing a blazer instead of a sweatshirt, trying to look like someone worth being proud of. The turkey was dry. The conversation was thinner. So Robert said, cutting into his food, "What are you making now?" "Enough to pay my rent," I said. He laughed. "Hope it's not one of those cute assistant roles. You know, the kind where they tell you you're doing great but never promote you." I picked up my fork and took a bite. I tasted nothing. I smiled anyway. Later on the back porch, Maggie joined me. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. "I am proud of you," she said softly. "Then why don't you say it when he's there?" I asked. She looked back toward the house where Robert's voice carried through the open window. "Because peace is easier than pride," she said. I nodded, even though something in my chest ached at the answer. That was the year I promised myself I would stop mistaking peace for safety. By my second year at UC Davis, exhaustion had become a kind of background noise, like traffic you stop noticing after a while. My days started before the sun came up and ended long after it set stitched together by coffee breaks and deadlines. I learned which campus paths were safest to bike at dawn, which vending machines ate your money, which corners of the library stayed quiet past midnight. I worked the early shift at a coffee shop, just off Russell Boulevard, tying my apron, while the city was still half asleep. By 7 a.m., my hands moved on muscle memory, pouring milk, pulling shots, smiling at professors who didn't know my name. I memorized orders, learned to count change quickly, learned how to look awake, even when my eyes burned. After class, I headed straight to the computer lab, or the library. Finance spreadsheets filled my screen. Numbers made sense to me in a way people rarely did. Numbers followed rules. If something didn't add up, there was a reason. Some nights I fell asleep with my laptop still open, forehead pressed against the keyboard, the glow of the screen imprinting itself behind my eyelids. Other nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, calculating interest rates on student loans I hadn't wanted, debts I hadn't chosen. My phone buzzed often. "Dad," sometimes I answered. Most times I didn't. When I did, the conversations were short. "How are your grades?" "Fine." "You staying out of trouble?" "Yes." "Good. Don't embarrass the family." That was the closest thing to concern he ever offered. In 2015, graduation arrived faster than I expected. The campus buzzed with families and balloons, parents clutching cameras, siblings wearing oversized smiles. I stood in my cap and gown, with my friends trying to ignore the empty space in the bleachers where my family should have been. My father had called the night before. "I can't make it," he said. "Important meeting." I told him it was okay. I told him I understood. I told him what he wanted to hear. As I waited in line to walk across the stage, I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. When my name was announced, I smiled, shook hands, accepted my diploma. The applause washed over me, anonymous and brief. Later that afternoon, sitting alone on the grass, I opened Facebook. The first photo on my feed showed my father standing on a manicured green arm around one of his business partners holding a golf trophy. His smile was wide, triumphant. The caption read, "Great day on the course with great company." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Then I closed the app and stood up. Back home that Thanksgiving, nothing had changed. The house looked exactly the same down to the seasonal centerpiece in the middle of the table. The air smelled like roasted turkey and restraint, so my father said, slicing into the bird with sharp, efficient movements, "Your big finance job now. How much are you making?" I swallowed my bite. "Enough to pay my own rent." He laughed. Not unkindly. Not kindly either. "You think you're independent now?" My fork hovered over my plate. "I think I'm managing. Hope it's not one of those cute secretary roles," he added. "You know, the kind where they tell you you're doing great, but never promote you?" Daniel snorted softly, hiding it behind his napkin. I took another bite of turkey. It was dry. Overcooked. I chewed slowly and smiled. I was fluent in pretending. After dinner, I escaped to the porch, pulling my coat tighter against the cold. The sky was dark, the neighborhood quiet. Maggie joined me a few minutes later, handing me a mug of tea. "I'm proud of you, Em," she said. I didn't look at her. "Then why don't you say it when he's there?" She sighed, staring out into the yard. Because peace is easier than pride. The words landed heavier than she intended. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just stood there, letting the cold seep into my bones. Over the next few years, I built a life that existed mostly outside that house. I moved to San Francisco. I took a job at Harbor Point Capital. I learned how to negotiate salaries, how to hold my ground in meetings, how to sound confident, even when I wasn't. I paid my loans on time. Every month. I watched the balance inch down slowly, painfully. Each payment felt like proof that I could survive without him. When my father called, it was usually to ask questions that sounded like concern, but felt like audits. You saving any money? You seeing anyone? You don't want to wait too long to settle down. I answered politely. I never volunteered information. I kept my life compartmentalized, neat-controlled, invisible. At family gatherings, I became background noise. The responsible one. The one who didn't need attention. The one who wouldn't make a scene. I told myself I preferred it that way. But sometimes late at night, when the city quieted and my apartment felt too small, I wondered what it would have been like to grow up somewhere louder. Somewhere applause wasn't optional. Somewhere pride didn't feel like a luxury. I promised myself I wouldn't live my whole life shrinking to make other people comfortable. I just didn't know yet what it would take to stop. I met Michael on a rooftop in San Francisco on a night when I'd almost talked myself into staying home. The city lights stretched out behind him. The bay. A dark shimmer in the distance, music pulsing low enough that people had to lean in to hear each other. It was a friend's birthday, the kind of gathering where everyone pretended not to check their phones every 5 minutes. I was standing near the railing nursing a drink I didn't really want when he appeared beside me like he'd always been there. You look like someone who prefers listening to talking, he said. I turned surprised and laughed before I could stop myself. Maybe I just ran out of people worth talking to. He smiled at that, not wide, not forced, just enough to show he understood the joke wasn't really a joke. I'm Michael, he said, offering his hand. Emily, I replied. We spent the rest of the night in conversation that felt effortless in a way I hadn't experienced before. He asked questions and waited for the answers. He didn't interrupt or redirect the conversation back to himself. When I paused, he didn't rush to fill the silence. That alone felt radical. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a rhythm that didn't demand explanations. Sushi dinners in quiet neighborhoods, long walks along the pier where the fog rolled in slow and thick, wrapping the city in something softer. We laughed easily, the kind of laughter that doesn't need to be loud to feel real. One evening, sitting across from each other at a small table by the window, he asked, "So what's your family like?" The question landed gently, but it still made me hesitate. My father has opinions, I said carefully. Not conversations. He nodded like that made perfect sense. So did mine. Until my mom left him. I looked up. Did it get better? Eventually, he said. After I stopped trying to make him understand. The words settled somewhere deep in my chest. It wasn't love at first sight. It was relief. The relief of being heard without having to perform. When Michael asked if he could meet my family, I said yes before I could overthink it. Part of me wanted to see how he'd fit into that world. Another part wanted proof that the life I'd built outside of my family wasn't as fragile as it sometimes felt. Dinner at my parents' house was exactly as I remembered. The table set just so, Maggie greeting us with a warm smile and a tight hug. My father standing back, arms crossed, assessing, "So you're the boyfriend." Robert said, shaking Michael's hand a little too firmly, "What do you do?" "I'm an attorney," Michael replied calmly. Robert raised an eyebrow. "Lawyer, huh?" "Hopefully not the kind that helps wives take their husband's money." A few people laughed. Daniel smirked. I felt my face heat with embarrassment. Michael didn't flinch. Actually, he said, his voice steady. "I help people protect what's rightfully theirs." The table went quiet. My father blinked clearly, not expecting that answer. Then he laughed loud and dismissive, as if he'd been the one to make a joke. "Well," he said, waving a hand, "we'll see how long that idealism lasts." Dinner moved on, but something had shifted. I could feel it. Michael met my eyes across the table, a silent question. "Are you okay?" I nodded. For once, it wasn't a lie. In the car on the way home, he asked, "Does he always talk to you like that?" I opened my mouth to defend him, to soften it, to explain it away the way I always had. Instead, I didn't. "Yes," I said. He didn't say anything else. He just reached over and took my hand. We pulled over halfway home. I cried for longer than I meant to, words tumbling out between sobs, years of small humiliations I'd never named aloud. He listened. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't interrupt. After that night, I noticed things I'd trained myself to ignore. The way my father talked over me in conversations. The way he praised Daniel for things I'd done years earlier. The way Maggie stayed quiet, eyes down whenever Robert's tone sharpened. Michael noticed too. He didn't comment right away. He didn't confront anyone. He just watched, remembered. Asked questions later when we were alone. When he proposed, it wasn't flashy. Just the two of us at a restaurant overlooking the water, the city humming in the background. "Emily," he said, voice steady, "I want to build a life where you don't have to make yourself smaller to belong." I said yes before he finished the sentence. When we announced the engagement, my mother cried. Daniel clapped me on the back. My father smiled and said, "I'll take care of the wedding. Consider it my gift." It sounded generous. I didn't realize yet what it would cost. But looking back, I know now. That dinner was the night Michael decided silence was over, and without telling me, he began paying attention in a way no one ever had before. After that dinner, nothing changed on the surface. That was the strange part. Life kept moving forward in its usual polite rhythm. But something underneath it had shifted like a floorboard, loosening just enough to creak when you stepped on it. Michael started noticing things I'd learned to ignore. At Sunday dinners, my father talked louder than everyone else, his stories stretching longer each time. He bragged about contracts, about new showrooms, about how hard he'd worked to build everything from nothing. One night, between bites of roast chicken, he raised his glass and said, "I just made another donation to a local scholarship fund. Education matters when you can afford it." A few people nodded approvingly. Someone said, "That's generous, Robert." Michael's eyes flicked to mine for half a second. I felt my throat tighten and looked down at my plate. Later, while Maggie cleared dishes, Aunt Helen sat with us in the living room cradling a mug of tea. Helen had always been the quieter one in the family, the kind of person who noticed details but rarely pushed. She tilted her head, studying me. "Whatever happened to your grandparents' trust fund?" she asked casually. "The one they set aside for your college?" The room went still. I shrugged, forcing my shoulders loose. Dad said it wasn't enough. He used it for other things. Helen frowned. "That's odd. It was supposed to cover everything." Michael leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember which bank handled it?" Helen blinked, surprised by the question. "I think so," she said slowly. "I'd have to check my old paperwork." My father walked back in, then conversation shifting before I could say anything else. But Michael didn't forget. He never forgot. A few days later, he drove with Helen to her house in Elk Grove, under the excuse of helping her sort through boxes in the garage. I stayed home telling myself not to overthink it, even though my stomach twisted all afternoon. When he came back, he didn't say anything right away. He set his jacket down, washed his hands, and sat beside me on the couch. Helen found something he said quietly. He pulled out his phone and handed it to me. On the screen was a photograph of a yellowed bank statement, the edges curled with age. The header read, "Education Trust, 2013. My name was printed just below it. I stared at the date. August 15th, 2013. Below it, in clean black numbers, was a single transaction. Withdrawal $45,000 transfer to Robert M. Carter. The paper looked brittle, like it might crumble if you touched it too hard, but the truth was fresh, sharp enough to cut. "He took it," I whispered. Michael nodded. "Every dollar." I felt something hollow open up inside my chest. Not surprise. Not really. Something closer to confirmation. Michael had already taken photos, made copies, emailed a scanned version to a colleague he trusted to hold on to it. He was methodical in a way that felt both comforting and terrifying. That night, I lay awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations I'd buried years ago. My father's voice. "Don't question me." My mother's silence. Helen's confusion. Around 2 a.m, Michael's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He checked it, sat up slightly, then stilled. "What is it?" I asked. "An email," he said. From someone who doesn't want to be named. He showed me the screen. I know what Robert did, but I can't talk. He'll ruin me. V. Reed. My heart pounded. Who is that? I'm not sure yet, Michael said, but they know something. He glanced at me, then back at the message. His jaw tightened just a fraction. He looked over at me, then down at the phone again, and whispered, Not this time. Over the next few weeks, things moved quietly. Too quietly. Michael didn't confront my father. He didn't tell me everything he was doing. He asked careful questions instead. About timelines. About names. About where certain people had been during certain years. I noticed my mother watching him more closely, too, her eyes lingering whenever he spoke to my father, her fingers worrying the edge of a napkin. One afternoon, she called me while I was at work. Are you happy? She asked abruptly. Yes, I said. Why? There was a pause. Michael seems attentive. I smiled despite myself. He listens. Another pause. That's rare, she said softly. Then changed the subject. A few days later, Michael met the sender of the email in person. Vanessa Reed. She was a former accountant at Carter Auto Group, someone I vaguely remembered seeing at company holiday parties years ago. Michael told me later that she'd been shaking when she sat down across from him at a small coffee shop in Folsom. She kept looking over her shoulder, he said, like she expected your father to walk in at any second. Vanessa told him everything. About the withdrawals. About the coded expense reports. About the instructions delivered in clipped, confident tones. She saved the messages, Michael said. Texts, emails, even a voice recording. My stomach twisted. Why would she keep them? She said she didn't trust him. She just didn't know what to do with the proof. I thought of all the times I'd trusted my father without evidence. All the times I'd swallowed questions because asking them felt dangerous. That evening, Michael and I sat on our balcony overlooking the city, the fog rolling in low and heavy. What are you thinking? He asked. I watched the lights blur in the distance. I'm thinking about how many people knew, I said, and how quiet everyone stayed. He didn't interrupt. I took a breath, and I'm thinking about what happens if I don't stay quiet anymore. He reached for my hand, his grip steady. Whatever you decide, he said, you won't be alone. For the first time in a long while, I believed it. And somewhere deep down, I knew this was no longer just about money. It was about what happens when the truth finally stops waiting to be invited in. Vanessa Reed didn't look like someone who wanted to be recognized. When Michael described her to me later, he said she sat with her shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to take up less space than the chair allowed. Her fingers kept circling the cardboard sleeve of her coffee cup, pressing and releasing it until it creased. She was 41, though stress had etched lines into her face that made her look older. Michael told me she chose the table farthest from the window, in a small coffee shop in Folsom. One where the espresso machine hissed loudly enough to swallow pieces of conversation. He said he loved me, she told Michael, her voice low but steady. 6 years. I kept his secrets. He promised he'd leave his wife. Michael didn't interrupt. He never did when it mattered. Vanessa slid her phone across the table. The screen lit up with messages. Robert's name at the top of the thread. I could imagine his tone even without hearing it. Sweet words mixed with instructions. Compliments followed by commands. Withdraw from account, ending 4427. Recode as marketing expense. She'll never know. That's your wife's education fund, isn't it? Vanessa asked quietly. Michael nodded once. He didn't soften it. Yes. Her hand trembled as she pulled the phone back. If he finds out I still have this. She didn't finish the sentence. He won't. Michael said, I'll make sure of it. When he told me that part, I felt 2 things at once. Gratitude sharp and immediate, and fear slower creeping in behind it, because I knew my father. I knew how he reacted when he felt cornered, while Michael was sitting across from Vanessa listening to years of lies unravel into facts. My mother was standing in her kitchen in Sacramento, holding a phone she hadn't expected to ring. The number was blocked. She answered anyway. Tell your daughter to stop digging, a man's voice said. It wasn't my father's, but it didn't need to be, or she won't like what happens next. My mother didn't respond. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought he might hear it. The line went dead. She stood there for a moment staring at the screen. Then she deleted the call from the log. Her hands were shaking so badly, she had to steady herself against the counter. Robert walked in a few seconds later, humming to himself, keys jingling as he tossed them into the bowl by the door. Everything okay? He asked casually, opening the fridge. Fine, she said too quickly. He didn't look at her. He never did when he didn't want to see something. Some silences are survival. Some are surrender. That night, Michael didn't tell me everything right away. He waited until we were both home, until we'd eaten dinner, and the city outside our windows had quieted into a low hum. We sat on the couch, knees touching. He took a breath before speaking. Vanessa kept more than texts, he said. She kept audio. He handed me his phone. The file was short. 30 seconds, maybe less. I pressed play with a thumb that felt numb. My father's voice filled the room. Calm, confident, familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. Transfer every penny, he said. She'll never know. There was no anger in his tone, no hesitation, just certainty. I ended the recording and stared at the dark screen. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Now we have him. Michael thought, though he didn't say it out loud. I could see it in the way his shoulders settled, in the way his eyes sharpened with focus. I felt something else entirely. I thought of every time my mother had looked away, every time Helen had changed the subject, every time I had laughed when I wanted to scream. How many people knew I asked, finally? Michael didn't pretend to know the answer. Enough. Over the next few weeks, the truth threaded itself through our lives quietly. Michael moved carefully, storing copies of files in places I didn't ask about. He made notes, dates, times. He asked Helen more questions gently, never pushing. She answered what she could, her voice tight with regret. Vanessa sent more messages, more screenshots. She was terrified, but she was also tired. I lost my marriage because of him, she told Michael during one call. 12 years, 2 kids, and he walked away like it was nothing. I wondered how many women had swallowed damage so he could keep his image intact. At family gatherings, my mother watched us with new eyes. Her gaze lingered on Michael longer than before. On me, too. Once, when Robert was in the other room, she reached out and touched my arm. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said. It was half true. She nodded like she understood something she hadn't yet named. Wedding planning started around that time, driven almost entirely by my father's enthusiasm. "I'll handle it," he announced over dinner. "The venue, the guest list. Consider it my gift." It sounded generous. It felt like control. I wanted a small ceremony. 50 people, friends, family who actually knew us. Robert booked Rosewood Estate in Napa Valley without asking. Invited nearly 200 guests, business associates, clients, people whose names meant nothing to me. Every time I tried to push back, he smiled and reminded me who was paying. Michael watched all of it. He didn't argue with my father. He didn't correct him. He just kept gathering pieces, fitting them together like a puzzle that had waited years to be solved. One night as we lay in bed, I turned to him and asked, "What happens if this all comes out?" He didn't answer right away. "Then things will change," he said finally. I stared up at the ceiling, imagining the fallout, the whispers, the anger, the way my father's face might look if he realized he couldn't talk his way out of this. Part of me was terrified. Another part felt strangely calm. Because for the first time, the silence wasn't mine alone to carry. And I knew deep down that the truth was done waiting. By August of 2024, Napa Valley looked exactly the way my father wanted it to look. Perfect. Expensive. Impressive. Rows of roses lined the pathways at Rosewood Estate, their colors too rich to feel accidental. Gold-trimmed invitations had gone out weeks earlier, thick paper that felt more like a business proposal than a celebration. Everywhere I looked, I saw money. And everywhere I listened, I heard my father's voice. "We'll invite 180 guests," Robert said, standing at the kitchen island with a legal pad scribbling names. "Maybe more if a few partners decide to bring their wives." I stared at the list. Most of the names meant nothing to me. "Dad," I said carefully, I wanted something small, 40 people maybe, friends, close family. He didn't look up. "This isn't about small Emily. It's about showing people who we are. Who we are, not who I was." The planning became a series of quiet defeats. I suggested white lilies. He replaced them with deep red roses. "White is boring," he said. "Red shows strength, power." I chose an acoustic band. I loved something soft and intimate. He canceled them and booked a full orchestra. "This is a wedding," he said, "not a coffee shop performance." Every decision I made was treated like a suggestion. Every decision he made was final. Michael watched it all happen from the edges, his expression unreadable. He didn't challenge my father. He didn't step in. He just paid attention the way he always did. One evening after another planning meeting that ended with my preferences ignored, I followed my father into the kitchen. "This is my wedding," I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. "Not your corporate event." He turned, slowly leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "And who's paying for it?" "That's not the point. It is the point," he said flatly. "If I'm funding this, it'll look like something worth the money." Every dollar he spent was a leash, not a gift. I walked out before he could say more. My hands were shaking when I reached our car. Michael didn't speak until we were home. That night we sat at the small kitchen table in our apartment, the contrast between our quiet space and my parents' house feeling stark. "There's something you need to see," he said. He opened his laptop and turned it toward me. Files filled the screen. Bank records, screenshots of messages, the audio file, dates, names, timestamps, everything laid out with careful precision. "I've compiled all of it," he said. "Multiple backups, copies, stored with people I trust." My throat tightened. "You've been planning this." "I've been preparing," he corrected gently. In case of what?" He met my eyes. "In case he humiliates you again." The words settled heavily between us. "You'd do this," I said slowly, at our wedding. Michael shook his head. "No, he would." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Part of me wanted to shut the laptop and pretend I'd never seen any of it. Part of me wanted to run. Another part felt something I wasn't ready to name yet. The phone rang. It was Aunt Helen. "Emily," she said without preamble, her voice tight. "Your mother knows about the money." I closed my eyes. "How she asked me," Helen said. "She said she'd always wondered why you took out loans. She confronted your father years ago. He threatened her, told her she'd regret it if she didn't stay quiet." My chest ached. "Is she okay?" "She's terrified," Helen said, "but she's done being afraid." I ended the call and walked to the window. The city lights blurred together, our reflection faint in the glass. "Then, maybe," I said quietly, "it's time he learned what fear feels like." The wedding day arrived before I was ready. I woke up at Rosewood Estate just after sunrise, the vineyards bathed in soft gold. Everything was already in motion. Staff moved quickly and silently, setting chairs, adjusting flowers, testing sound equipment. My mother came to help me get dressed. She looked older than she had a few months earlier. Tired, but when she saw me in my gown, her eyes filled with tears. "You look beautiful," she said. She paused. "I'm sorry it took me so long to protect you." I hugged her tightly, breathing her in. Outside, I could hear my father's voice, loud and commanding, directing staff. "Make sure the projector's working," he said. "We'll need it for the slideshow." I felt Michael's hand brush mine as he came up behind me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Vows, applause, photos. My father beamed for the cameras, proud and pleased with the spectacle he'd created. At the reception, he worked the room like a politician, shaking hands, laughing loudly, reminding everyone how much he'd spent to make the night perfect. Dinner was served. The orchestra played. Glasses were refilled. Then my father stood up. I watched him pick up the microphone, his posture confident, his smile ready. I felt my heart pound, not with fear this time, but with something steadier. Whatever happened next, it was already in motion. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't planning to stop it. The reception looked flawless, the kind of flawless that only money can buy. Chandeliers cast warm light across polished marble floors. Champagne flutes caught the glow and scattered it in every direction. Every table was dressed perfectly, every detail checked and double-checked by a staff that moved like shadows. My father loved it, loved. He drifted from group to group, clapping men on the back, kissing women on the cheek, his voice carrying easily above the music. "This is my daughter's big day," he said again and again. No expense spared. I watched him from my seat beside Michael, my hands folded in my lap. It was never about celebrating love. It was about reminding everyone who he thought he was. Dinner plates clinked softly as servers cleared them away. The orchestra lowered its volume. Conversations dulled into a hum. I felt it before it happened, the shift in the room, the way attention bent toward him like it always did. Robert Carter stood and walked toward the microphone. My heart thudded once hard. I didn't look at Michael. I didn't need to. I knew he felt it too. My father tapped the mic lightly, smiling as the room quieted. "I'd like to say a few words," he said. I'd spent my whole life trying not to make him look bad. That night I stopped trying. Raise your glass, he said, lifting his own. To the daughter who finally found someone desperate enough to marry her. Laughter rolled across the room. It wasn't cruel in intent, just careless, the kind that came from people who assumed this was all harmless. My cheeks burned. My smile froze halfway into place. I felt the moment stretch thin and fragile. Then Michael stood. He didn't rush. He didn't slam his chair back or raise his voice. He simply rose and walked toward the projector at the side of the room, the one my father had insisted on for the engagement slideshow. I'd like to add something, Michael said. My father chuckled into the microphone. By all means. Michael plugged in the USB drive. The lights dimmed automatically. But not as desperate as you are right now, he said calmly. The words rippled through the room, confusion spreading like a slow wave. My father's smile faltered just for a fraction of a second. The screen flickered. A bank statement filled the wall behind Michael. Large, impossible to ignore. Education fund withdrawal, $45,000 transferred to Robert M. Carter. Gasps cut through the silence. My father's mouth opened, closed. Michael clicked to the next slide. Screenshots of text messages appeared, dates and names clearly visible. Withdraw the funds. Recode as marketing expense. She'll never know. Whispers erupted around the room. I heard someone suck in a sharp breath. Someone else dropped a fork. My father lunged toward the microphone. Turn that off, he snapped. This is slander. Michael didn't move. It's called evidence. The final file played. An audio clip. My father's voice echoed through the hall, clipped and unmistakable. Transfer every penny. She'll never know. The sound seemed to hang in the air long after it ended. My father staggered back, reaching for the table beside him. His champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor with a sharp crack that cut through everything else. The room went silent. For once, the man who demanded attention couldn't find his own words. I looked at my mother. She stood slowly, one hand pressed to her mouth, eyes fixed on the screen. Her shoulders shook, but she didn't sit back down. Daniel stared straight ahead, his face drained of color. He didn't speak. He didn't laugh. He didn't move. My father tried again, his voice rising. This is a private family matter. You made it public, Michael said evenly. When you picked up that microphone. A man near the front stood up. Thomas Green, one of my father's longest business partners. He didn't say anything. He simply took his wife's hand and walked toward the exit. Others followed. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Conversations broke into hushed, urgent murmurs. Phones came out screens glowing in the dim light. My father looked around, his confidence draining away with every step toward the door. Michael turned to face the room. I'm not desperate, he said, his voice steady. I'm lucky. Emily is brilliant. She's kind. She's stronger than anyone I know. And she spent years being told she wasn't enough by a man who stole from her and lied to everyone in this room. He met my father's eyes. You had decades to be her father, he said. You chose to be her bully. My father's jaw tightened. You'll regret this, he said quietly. Michael didn't respond. I apologize for the disruption, Michael said to the room. If you'd like to stay and celebrate with us, you're welcome. If not, we understand. He stepped away from the microphone. My father stood there for a moment longer, scanning the room like he was waiting for someone to save him. No one did. Then he turned and walked out. The doors closed behind him with a soft, final sound. I sat there, my hands trembling slightly, my heart pounding, and waited for the guilt to hit. The instinct to apologize, it didn't come. It didn't. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar and light spread through my chest. I could breathe. Michael returned to my side and took my hand. His thumb brushed my knuckles, grounding me. Are you okay? He asked quietly. I looked around the room, at my mother, who was wiping her eyes but standing tall, at the guests who remained watching us with something like respect, at the shattered glass on the floor already being swept away. Yes, I said. I think I am. The band hesitated, then started playing again softly at first. Life somehow went on, and for the first time it was moving forward without him. The silence after my father left didn't last long. It cracked open into whispers, sharp and urgent, spreading across the room like heat through glass. People leaned toward each other, hands covering mouths that couldn't quite contain what they'd just witnessed. Phones were raised openly now. No one pretended this wasn't happening. I stayed seated, my fingers still laced with Michael's, trying to ground myself in the feel of his skin against mine. My heart was racing, but beneath it was a strange stillness, like something heavy had finally been set down. A man near the front stood up slowly. Thomas Green, one of my father's oldest business partners. I'd known him my whole life. He'd been at our house for holidays, laughed too loudly at my father's jokes, brought expensive wine, and shook my hand like I was an accessory to the evening. His face was pale now. "Robert," he said, his voice carrying farther than he seemed to intend. "We're done." My father turned back toward him, disbelief flickering across his features. "Tom, let's not do this here." Thomas shook his head. 15 years, he said. "And this is what you are." He didn't wait for an answer. He took his wife's hand and walked toward the exit. She didn't look back. Others followed. Not all at once, but steadily. Chairs scraped. Coats were collected. People murmured apologies that weren't meant for me or Michael, just for themselves, for staying too long. I watched them go with a numb detachment, like I was observing a scene through glass. My mother appeared beside me, then her face drawn tight, her hands trembling as she reached for my arm. "You knew," she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I turned toward her. "Not until now." I said honestly. "Did you?" Her eyes filled tears, streaking the careful makeup she'd applied hours earlier. She nodded once. "He told me," she said, "years ago. He said if I told you we'd lose everything." I swallowed. "We already did." She pressed a hand to her mouth, a quiet sob breaking free. I pulled her into me, holding her as her shoulders shook. Behind us, my father tried to reclaim the room. "This is ridiculous!" He snapped, his voice cracking as it rose. "You ungrateful little—" "Dad, stop!" Daniel stepped between us. It took me a second to register what I was seeing. My brother stood taller than I'd ever seen him, his posture rigid, his jaw set. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't smirking. He was blocking my father's path. Robert stared at him, stunned. "Get out of my way." Daniel didn't move. "I'm not covering for you anymore," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. The room seemed to hold its breath. My father looked at his son like he was seeing him for the first time, like he was trying to remember where this version of Daniel had come from. Daniel turned to me then. His eyes softened just a little. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have seen it sooner." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. We were all victims of his control. The difference was I finally stopped volunteering for it. My father looked around the room one last time, his face hardening as he realized no one was stepping forward. No partner, no friend, no family member rushing to smooth things over. "You'll regret this," he said again, the words weaker now, fraying at the edges. No one responded. He turned and walked out alone. The doors closed behind him. No one followed. For a moment, the room existed in a strange limbo. Half-full tables, unfinished drinks, a wedding that had split cleanly down the middle. Then someone laughed. A small, nervous sound that quickly died. The band hesitated, then resumed playing softer this time, unsure but persistent. Life, stubborn as it was, kept moving. Michael squeezed my hand. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. I looked around. At my mother, who was wiping her face and standing straighter than she had in years. At Daniel, who hovered awkwardly nearby, unsure where he belonged now. At the guests who remained watching us with something that looked like respect. "No," I said after a moment. "I want to stay." We cut the cake. We danced. The laughter that followed was different from before. Quieter, realer. Later that night, when the last guests had gone and the staff began clearing tables, I stepped outside into the cool Napa air. The vineyard stretched out under the stars, calm and indifferent. Michael joined me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "You okay?" he asked. I leaned back against him, watching the lights glow softly behind us. I think I said slowly, "This is what it feels like to stop paying the price of silence." He kissed the top of my head. In God, the music played on. And somewhere beyond the gates of the estate, my father's world was already beginning to fall apart. 2 weeks after the wedding, my phone buzzed with a news alert while I was standing in line for coffee. I almost ignored it, muscle memory telling me bad news could wait. Then I saw the headline, "Carter Auto Group under investigation for tax fraud." It felt unreal seeing my last name printed like that, bold and public, stripped of the authority it had carried my entire life. I read the article twice, my hands steady, my pulse surprisingly calm. The Sacramento Chronicle didn't waste time. According to the report, federal investigators had opened a formal inquiry into multiple financial irregularities connected to my father's dealerships, offshore accounts, falsified expense reports, shell transfers that had been buried under layers of paperwork for years. Daniel was mentioned too. That part made my stomach drop. Michael was already awake when I got home, his laptop open on the kitchen table, news tabs filling the screen. He looked up when he saw my face. "You saw it," he said. I nodded. "Daniel's involved. Not the way it looks," Michael said carefully. "They brought him in for questioning this morning. We drove to Sacramento that afternoon. Daniel looked exhausted. When we saw him, dark circles under his eyes, his confidence stripped away along with the illusion he'd been protected by proximity. He used my social security number," Daniel said, running a hand through his hair. "Set up accounts in my name. I didn't even know they existed." I believed him. For the first time, Daniel wasn't defending our father. He was cooperating. The investigators listened. They took notes. They asked questions Daniel answered without hedging. Watching him, I realized how much of his life had been built on loyalty he never fully chose. Vanessa Reed agreed to testify. She entered witness protection quietly, without press or announcement. When I spoke to her briefly on the phone, her voice was steadier than I expected. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said, "but I'm done being afraid. So was I." Michael and I filed a civil suit the following week. The amount was simple: $45,000 plus accrued interest, money that had never belonged to him in the first place. The courtroom smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. It echoed when people moved, every footstep too loud, every cough amplified. I sat beside Michael, my hands folded, my back straight. Robert Carter sat across the room in a gray suit that hung looser than it used to. He looked older than I remembered, smaller. His hair was thinner, his posture less assured. He didn't look at me. The judge entered. We stood. We sat. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, flipping through the file, "do you understand the charges brought against you?" My father cleared his throat. "This is a family matter," he said, his voice strained. "It doesn't belong in court." Michael stood. "It belongs exactly here." The judge nodded, unimpressed. The hours that followed blurred together. Statements. Evidence entered into record. The audio clip played again. My father's voice filling the room, stripped of context and charm, reduced to intention. "Transfer every penny. She'll never know." He flinched when it played. I didn't. Negotiations happened behind closed doors. Lawyers went back and forth. Numbers were adjusted. Terms were argued. In the end, the settlement was straightforward. $50,000 paid to me over 24 months. No confidentiality clause. No non-disclosure agreement. No conditions that required my silence. For once, he couldn't buy silence. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered near the steps. Microphones ready, cameras flashing. I stayed back, my arm linked through Michael's. My mother stepped forward instead. She looked different, lighter. Her shoulders were back, her chin lifted. "It took 30 years, she said quietly when someone asked for a comment. "But I'm finally free." She filed for divorce that same week. Helen hugged me tightly afterward, her embrace lingering. "You didn't just stand up for yourself, dear," she said. "You stood up for every woman who was told to keep quiet." I thought of Vanessa, of my mother, of myself at 17, clutching an acceptance letter in a cold dining room. As we drove home, the city fading behind us, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. The fight wasn't over. There would be appeals, consequences, fallout I couldn't yet see. But something fundamental had shifted. My father no longer defined the narrative. That night, sitting on our couch, I opened the first envelope from the settlement. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. The truth had reached the courtroom, and it had stayed there. By the time spring arrived in 2025, the Carter name had quietly disappeared from places it once dominated. The dealership signs came down first. One by one, the bold lettering was removed, leaving pale outlines on brick walls where decades of certainty had been bolted in place. The lots emptied. Inventory was sold off, assets liquidated. The process was efficient and unceremonious, like erasing chalk from a board that had already been abandoned. I drove past one of the old locations on a gray morning traffic light flickering red above the intersection. Where the showroom windows once reflected my father's image back at him, there was now a banner announcing new ownership. No mention of legacy, no trace of his name. I didn't feel satisfaction, just distance. Robert Carter now lived alone in a small suburban house outside Sacramento, far from vineyards and gala dinners. The place was modest, almost anonymous. Curtains drawn, lawn trimmed but lifeless. Neighbors who nodded politely but didn't linger. His phone stayed quiet. No partners calling, no staff waiting on instructions. That silence used to belong to me. Daniel found his footing in an unexpected way. He sold his stake in what remained of the business and opened a small auto shop under his own name. No flashy branding, no corporate language, just honest work. One afternoon, a text came through from him, a photo, a simple sign bolted above a single garage door, Carter Free Motors. I stared at it for a long time before replying. Proud of you, I typed, and meant it. We weren't close, not in the way siblings in movies are, but we were honest now. That was new. That was enough. My mother moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, 15 minutes from our place. The first time I visited, the rooms still smelled faintly of fresh paint. Sunlight poured through wide windows. She'd arranged the furniture herself, slowly, deliberately, like someone learning how to take up space again. We started having lunch together every Sunday. Nothing elaborate. Soup, sandwiches, whatever we felt like making. We talked about small things at first. Shows she was watching. A book I'd just finished. The neighbor's dog that barked too much. Sometimes in the middle of a sentence, she would stop and look around the room like she was still surprised she was allowed to be there. "It's quiet," she said once. I smiled. That's what peace sounds like. Michael thrived in the aftermath in a way that felt steady, not triumphant. He spoke at a legal ethics conference that spring, standing at a podium in a room filled with attorneys who nodded along as he spoke. "Family doesn't excuse injustice," he said. "It makes it more important to face." I watched from the back of the room, my chest warm, with something like pride. With the first installment of the settlement, I did something I'd been thinking about for months. I worked with a nonprofit to establish a small scholarship, $5,000, not life-changing but meaningful. We named it the Moore Grant for Women in Finance, after my mother, after Aunt Helen. The first recipient was a girl from Sacramento, smart, determined, working 2 jobs to pay her way through college. When she called to thank me, her voice shook with disbelief. "No one's ever done this for me," she said. I closed my eyes and breathed in deeply. Someone should have, I told her. One morning, a plain envelope arrived in our mailbox. No return address, no stamps that hinted at urgency or importance. I recognized the handwriting immediately. "Inst" was a single sheet of paper. "You can hate me, but I'll always be your father." I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the letter resting beneath my hands. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel relief. I felt finished. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in a drawer with old documents and things I no longer needed to see every day. Then I closed it gently. I didn't cry. I didn't respond. Some things end without closure, and that's okay. That evening, Michael and I walked along the pier as the sun dipped low, the water catching fire with reflected light. The city hummed behind us, alive and indifferent. "What are you thinking?" he asked. I watched a boat cut slowly across the bay. "About how quiet my life feels now," he smiled. "Is that a good thing?" I nodded. "It is." For the first time, peace didn't feel like something I had to earn. It was just there, waiting. The morning started like any other. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen window, catching dust motes in the air. The kettle clicked off as I poured hot water over coffee grounds, the familiar scent filling the room. The radio hummed softly on the counter, a local station cycling through headlines between songs. I wasn't really listening until I heard his name. Local businessman, Robert Carter, dies of heart failure at 63. I froze with my mug halfway to my lips. The announcer's voice stayed even professional. No dramatic pause, no elaboration, just a line and a date. No mention of a funeral, no glowing obituary, No photograph pulled from better years. I set the mug down slowly and stood there staring at nothing. I had imagined this moment before, in darker days. I'd pictured anger, relief, vindication, some sharp emotion that would finally make sense of everything. What I felt instead was quiet. Michael came into the kitchen a few minutes later, still sleepy, rubbing his eyes. He saw my face before I said anything. "What is it?" he asked. I nodded toward the radio. "It's him." He didn't need clarification. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around me from behind his chin, resting lightly on my shoulder. We stood like that for a while, the kettle cooling the radio, moving on to weather updates and traffic. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. I searched for the answer and realized it was already there. "I think so." I said, and I meant it. That evening I drove alone toward the coast. The city gave way to open road, then to the steady presence of the Pacific stretching wide and endless. I parked near a quiet stretch of beach as the sun began its slow descent. The wind whipped my hair around my face as I stepped onto the sand. I carried a small bouquet of white lilies, simple and unadorned. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just acknowledgement. I walked closer to the water, the waves pulling back and rushing forward in a rhythm older than any of us. "I don't hate you," I whispered, feeling a strange calm settle in my chest. "I just don't belong to you anymore." I placed the flowers on the sand and stepped back, watching as the tide reached them, lifted them gently, and carried them away. Michael joined me, then his fingers brushing mine, grounding me. We stood together in silence, the wind loud in our ears, the horizon painted in shades of gold and blue. As we turned back toward the car, I felt something loosen inside me, a tension I hadn't realized I was still holding. For 30 years, I thought silence was safety. Turns out the loudest thing I ever did was speak. On the drive home, the radio played softly again. The same station, the same calm voices. The world hadn't stopped. It had barely noticed, and somehow that felt right. If someone you love once made you feel small, tell your story. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise or applause. Sometimes it begins the moment you stop staying quiet.